Well, thank you so much for coming to the third and final piece of our School to Prison Pipeline Education Initiative. For those who aren't familiar with the term, the School to Prison Pipeline refers to the direct and indirect manners in which kids get pushed out of school and into the criminal legal system. An example of a direct connection would be a child being arrested at school. An example of an indirect connection would be a child being suspended, then feeling isolated and also unsupervised and breaking into a car during their suspension. This afternoon, you're going to learn a little about a lot from our various local experts and practitioners. If you were able to attend the first two events on public school funding in North Carolina and restorative practices, I hope this conversation gives you more context as to how that information fits into the school to prison pipeline. If you weren't able to attend those events, and even if you were, my hope is that you treat tonight as an entry point into several deeper conversations. And I'm grateful to be able to finish this initiative here in the chapel, because whatever faith background you come from, or if you come from no faith background at all, I'm hoping that we are all here because we agree that children are sacred. My challenge to you after you leave is to think seriously about what you can do to convey that, and not just to some children, but to all children. We, as individuals and our society as a whole, have to reflect that children are sacred in the way that we vote, how we spend our tax dollars, our legislation, the things we pay attention to, and to any divinity school professors out there, our theology. Our public school system touches just about every social justice issue: health equity, disability rights, racial justice, food insecurity. The list goes on and on. We can't say that we care about these things, but ignore what's going on in our public school system. Our public school system is the one place that should be the touch point for all of our most vulnerable children. After you hear from our experts, you're going to hear from two women, Shannon and Angela, who fight day in, day out to enforce the sanctity of children that they care for. And then we will open it up to audience questions so that you guys can ask the experts any questions that you have. And in the spirit of coalition building, we have three moderators: myself, I'm a divinity student; we have Taylor Dempsey, a law student; and Gabby Carter, an undergrad student. And our panelists are, you can follow along with your sheet, Eric Zogri, John Powell, Peggy Nicholson, Carlton Powell, and Reverend Parker. And without further ado, Gabby's going to get us started with some questions.
Okay, so we're just going to quickly learn a little bit about why our panelists are here and how they contribute to fighting this inequity in our public school system. So if each of you, just in the order that you're sitting, could just explain a little bit about how you contribute to fighting the school to prison pipeline and why you do what you do, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Is this thing on? Yes. I made the wrong choice. I thought I was sitting at the end. That was a tactical error on my part. So my name is Eric Zagra. I'm the North Carolina State Juvenile Defender. I could take up the whole time just explaining what that is, but I'll glad to talk to folks after about what I do. But this issue started long before there was an Office of the Juvenile Defender. For me personally, I practiced law in Greensboro for 6 years, and it's pretty simple that in 1999, I started in February, and in July we had no cases. And in August we had no cases. And in most of September we had no cases. Greensboro had the highest rate of delinquency in the state, and we had no cases that summer. Why was that? Anyone? School was out. There was no school. So there were no kids coming through. Or very few. It was obvious. It was sort of on the front end, that part of North Carolina addressing this. School resource officer was kind of a new term, and nobody kind of knew what to do with it. The defenders, the prosecutors, the judges, we just didn't understand why school fights and, mooning the classroom was suddenly a crime. But I also had the opportunity and pleasure to work and start the first teen court in Greensboro, and so that was a whole nother experience while I was representing kids. I couldn't be a judge in teen court because my boss was like, yeah, you can't preside over them and then represent them when they fail their contract. That's a bad thing. But I was able to kind of see it firsthand what was happening. You also, of course, noticed that the charges emanated from specific schools in specific parts of Greensboro. And so by the time I became state defender, you know, this was going to be one of our core policy issues. And so we do things like I come and talk and, you know, help, you know, elucidate whatever I can sort of from an internal perspective. But the main thing is that until this past year, which was interesting, but before the pandemic, the only thing you need to know is, like, in all of juvenile court across the state, somewhere between 40 and 45% of every charge emanated from school for the last basically 15 years. And I say that for two reasons. One, because it's consistent, right? And the second reason is people have actually been working on this for a decade, and we've seen almost no change, which we should also think about and why that hasn't worked. So that's a challenge probably for the next generation to try to figure this out, because I don't think my generation has.
So my name is John Powell. I'm a defense attorney by trade and experience, but I have directed the Restorative Justice Clinic at the Campbell University Law School for the last 20 years. Unbelievable. I know you look at me and don't think it's possible that I'm old enough for that to be a true statement, but it is a true statement. And I think I just want to start with my why first, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I think I'll combat some of this stuff. My why is that I went to law school a little bit later in life than most. I was 36. I was married with a mortgage and 3 children. I was all grown up. And I really wanted to make a difference in people's lives. And so I thought, I will be working in a criminal legal system where I'll be squarely in the middle of people's situations and I'll be able to make a difference. And I was so wrong about the way that I thought our system was set up. I thought it was set up to help. And I learned, and I still believe it is not set up to help. It is set up to understand what law's been broken, who broke it, and what punishment do they deserve. I worked across the board. I worked in juvenile court. I worked in adult court. I did cases from school fights to murder. And I was always thinking, if we could do something with the kids, maybe I could work myself out of a job with the adults. And like Eric, that's wrong too, but we're still working on it, and I do think that we're making progress. But I became very frustrated very quickly, and every day thinking there's got to be a better way to approach these cases, especially with these kids. Also realizing that about 60% of the cases that I was defending kids on had been sent to our criminal legal system from their schools. Now, this is back in the day, right? It still happens today, way too frequently, but I'm a little bit, I don't know the right word, but I work in places that have adopted a lot of restorative practices. So I guess my feelings are somewhat skewed because of that. I don't see, I mean, I read about what's happening across the state and across the country, but I don't see it on a day-to-day like I see the use of restorative practices, which I'm very happy about that. I've always had kind of a twofold mission within the clinic, and by the way, I was introduced to restorative justice through a man named Tony Baker, who was a brand new law professor at Campbell when I was a practicing attorney. And we met at a seminar, and over coffee, we're getting to know each other. He learned I was a criminal defense attorney. He learned I had just been certified as a civil mediator in Superior Court. He said, "You ever thought about using mediation in your criminal practice?" I thought, this guy is a fool. I didn't say that. I said, well, no, because I don't think I can let my clients sit in a room and talk about what they've done, because the way the state will be against them. He said, I get it. He said, let's keep talking. He knew things that I didn't know. And so he wanted a clinic in the law school. I wanted a service in the court system. to provide for all the needs that people were walking into the court with, not just victims of crime, but offenders as well. And so those two things came together very nicely. And we proposed to the dean and to the chief judge that we would like to do a clinic and provide this service to the court. And they both, I was astonished, they both were very excited and said, yes, let's do this. As it turned out, serendipitously or by divine intervention, I prefer to think divine intervention, the chief judge was working on a juvenile court improvement project at the time. He said, this is perfect. And so we pursued it. They created a task force. We pursued it for about a year and a half. And at the end of that, we had found money to fund it, because the first thing the dean said is, I'm for it if it doesn't cost me any money, and that's what deans say. And so we found the money through the Governor's Crime Commission, and we started in October of 2003. And I kind of laughed and smiled to myself when Eric was talking about not having any cases, not having any cases, not having any cases. In our first semester of operating the clinic, we got 3 referrals. And let me tell you, there were a lot more cases coming into the juvenile court than 3. But it was good. We needed to start slow. We needed to have success. We did in all those cases. The next semester we got 10. Quite an improvement. We had success, and the next year we had more than we could, as they say in my hometown, shake a stick at. So my frustration was being alleviated through the restorative justice program. Since then, we have expanded into the adult courts. We get private referrals from people that have lost loved ones to murder. Some of you know that we recently did a victim offender dialogue case and a rape case. That meeting, pre-meeting, meeting, after meeting was videotaped, so it will be coming out hopefully in January, that you can all see the power of that. We have helped the Wake County school system create their own restorative practice program, so I don't go into the schools a lot anymore. I still go in special circumstances, but I'm very glad that we've been able to help school systems, and I get requests from other school systems all the time to help them to do this work. So there's a lot of depth and breadth to what we've been able to do over 20 years, and I'm very glad that there's so much more left to do.
Supervising attorney in the Duke Children's Law Clinic, so just across campus over at the law school. And to start with my why, I have to thank both Eric and John, because when I was a new attorney in 2011, coming out of law school, wanting to come back to North Carolina, wanting to work on education issues, conversations with both of them helped really narrow my focus on the school of prison pipeline in North Carolina and work that I could do as an attorney to try to keep children out of the school of prison pipeline. And I started at Legal Aid of North Carolina. It's not on, sorry. It was a very difficult issue that he had to fix, not my fault. Thank you. So I was at Legal Aid of North Carolina and focused on representing children in education proceedings who were also juvenile court involved. So really that intersection of school and juvenile court. And one of my first cases was an 8-year-old in a rural county, not too far from here, that had been sent to juvenile court for standing on a chair and shaking his pencil in a threatening manner at his teacher. So this 8-year-old, whose parents did not speak any English, had been, by the time I got involved, to a few court hearings where it was continued, he was missing school. You know, I started investigating, learned from talking with the parent, from talking with the child's doctors, that this child had ADHD that was manifesting in his behavior at school, was not being appropriately addressed. The school knew that and had not done anything to kind of support this child, other than refer him to juvenile court and suspend him repeatedly. And so sitting in court with an 8-year-old who had no idea what was going on, who was missing school even though he desperately needed to be in school with the right interventions to help him actually be successful in a classroom, you know, was a really drove home to me like the extent of the work that needed to be done, as well as all the direct and indirect ways that children and families get pulled into this pipeline. And so since that time have continued to practice mostly in the education space, representing children. And now at the clinic, we supervise law students who take those cases. And so most of our cases involve special education, lack of appropriate services at school, some school discipline, students with disabilities, and to the point about, again, those direct and indirect ways, we see, discrimination in schools. Those are school to prison pipeline cases. Special education, those are school to prison pipeline cases. Bullying cases, those are school to prison pipeline cases, potentially, because the kids who are disproportionately affected are Black kids, brown kids, Native kids, LGBTQ kids, kids with disabilities, and they are being funneled and pushed out, maybe not directly through a school resource officer, maybe not directly for a school suspension, but certainly being pushed out by being told, this is not the place for you, and you need to go be somewhere else. And so thinking about all those cases in the context of the school to prison pipeline, I think helps situate our work with law students and helps them connect it to some of the other social justice issues they might be learning about, like mass incarceration, and other things that kind of permeate the air and justice issues in the law school. Yeah, he's great. He's got it.
Thanks, Peggy. I'm Carlton Powell. I'm an attorney at Legal Aid's Right to Education Project. We file complaints against school boards, mainly when their students' rights are being violated for a variety of reasons. My focus is discipline. So I'll file a complaint against a school district where a student is placed into an alternative school in lieu of a suspension. And while at that alternative school, he or she receives no education there. Children here have a right to a sound basic education, and they're denied that right often and regularly. And so, yeah, we try to do something about that. Why I'm here and doing this work is to keep children in school, because I don't see how they can be expected to succeed or prosper or do for themselves without some form of an education. My great-grandfather built 40 or so Rosenwald schools in Halifax County. Those are schools for Black children when we couldn't go to school. My great-grandfather on my father's side put a school in the bottom of a church in Warren County for Black children because we couldn't go to school. So this is just part of a continuum. I'm a part of a continuum. I was also a teacher in Warren County for 5 years. I was a public defender in Philadelphia for 5 years. I'm doing this work now for all the same reasons. Just some of my students might want to fight me. Stood up in class, said they want to fight me. I told them to go for a walk. Thought a student's going to shoot me. I started tutoring them. I didn't send them. I didn't suspend them. I was teaching them reading. That's what I believe in. It's poverty reduction. It's civil rights. We'll just say real quick, and there's the genetics and the spirit of my ancestors, I suppose, but I also was born and raised in New Orleans, even though all my folk are from here. And in the 90s, New Orleans was a very violent place. One of my friends, who was probably the smartest of my group, was part of a triple homicide. He was a getaway driver. And I remember as a kid kind of thinking it was funny until one of my classmates made me see how silly I was. This young man was a genius, and somehow he ended up facing some very serious charges. And I think maybe that might be the thing, maybe one of the things that, in addition to where my folk came from and the work they did, that steered me in this direction. I just came up with a lot of guys and went to school at Morehouse College, played a lot of basketball in the streets of New Orleans, and I just saw genius. And I guess what I see in the school to prison pipeline is that genius going wasted. And I want to stop that from happening.
Can you hear this? Is it on? Yes, it's on? Okay. Well, I'm Suzanne Parker Miller, and I'm the director of Pastors for North Carolina Children. We are mobilizing faith communities across the state to work on public education, to bring equity and build beloved community, because we believe that that's what public schools do. They bring together everybody. They help to get you get to know your neighbor. You get to know how others live and how they play and how they live and how they learn. And it's a place to build community. And that's something that we are about as people of faith. I got into this work. I was a pastor out of seminary. I served a church for a few years and then had kids. And my mom had taught. And so I had spent a lot of time as a kid in her classroom helping out. You know, I'm really good at bulletin boards and cutting out letters and things before you could punch them out. And when my own child, my oldest, who's now in 6th grade, when he entered kindergarten, I started seeing the difference in how the schools were lacking in resources. And my kids were at a great school in Wake County. They're in the magnet program. We love their school, but I could just see the lack of adults in the building and the lack of resources and the need for paper. Like, why do we run out of copy paper in March or April every year? It's ridiculous. Why do we have to bring in all of the supplies that we do at the beginning of the year? I don't remember doing that as a kid. And so I had started getting involved with the Moral Monday protests about 10 years ago and started paying attention to education. And when my own child, when it started affecting our family, I went, whoa, what's going on? And got involved as a mom first and really started seeing and learning about North Carolina's, we have a history of being a good education state, and in many ways, never perfect, but good, and that has really changed over the last 30 years. And so started to understand the issues more and started hearing in education circles saying we need faith communities speaking up. We need faith communities involved. And that was kind of the intersection for me of, hey, this is my professional career and my interests and everything. So ended up connecting with Pastors for Texas Children, which was the first, and we now have about 9 states that have a Pastors for Children organization, mostly in the Southeast. So this has been a journey for me to learn about advocacy, to learn about policy, how the North Carolina system works, and being able to just start building networks of folks who can help us to speak up and say, North Carolina has the opportunity and the potential to do right by all of our children, but we are not taking that opportunity. Our legislators are not doing what is necessary and what is right. Our children's rights are being denied, and they have been for over 30 years. And for me, this comes down to, theologically, this is our love of our neighbors. Our communities, we're called to love our neighbors. It's one of the 2 greatest commandments. We see Jesus in, as Matthew 25 says, we see Jesus in those that we serve, that we provide, for, services for, water for, food, which is what our schools are doing. And it's also, for me, it's the Imago Dei. Every single child in North Carolina and everywhere contains within them the spark of God. And therefore, it is up to us to care for every single child. And if we are not doing that, we are not living out our faith as we're called to. And as we know, the majority of children in this country are attending traditional public schools. So that's where we focus our efforts. Traditional public schools being those that are part of a district, what you think of as Durham Public Schools, Wake County Public Schools, one of North Carolina's 115 districts. And that they are required to serve every child. Every single child who walks in the front door of the school must be served. And so that is where our most vulnerable children are. And therefore, those are the ones that I'm most concerned about, because our most vulnerable children are often the ones who then end up in the school to prison pipeline. And that is because our schools don't have the resources that they need to be able to more productively address the children's needs so very often.
Well, great. I can't tell if this is on. Is it? Okay, well, I think I'm loud enough regardless. Thank you all for being here, and I want to thank our panelists for spending the past few minutes explaining exactly why we asked you to be on the panel. And I want to talk about the school disciplinary process for a minute. So I would love if one or, oh no, it's happening to me. Oh, there we go. I was hoping one or two of you could give a brief survey of what disciplinary actions schools can take against children. And anyone can just jump in.
This is Carlton's specialty. You go.
Will that be suspensions of various stripes, in-school suspensions, short-term suspensions, which are exclusions from school for disciplinary reasons for 10 days or less, long-term suspensions, 10 days or more, and what we're seeing a lot, well, there's expulsions too, of course, and what we're seeing a lot of now are placements at alternative schools, because students can be placed at those schools and not be provided due process rights. So they can't challenge their placement in court, and oftentimes they can't challenge those placements in front of school boards. So a principal can refer the student to an alternative school, and you might be able to ask the superintendent to reconsider, and generally your challenge stops there. So this is a way for schools to get undesirable children out of school without having to answer to anyone. So that's, I'm spending a lot of time on that one, because that's a practice where I'm trying to fight heavily, because once kids are placed at these schools, they're not taught anything. And a lot of kids are being placed there. The numbers are hard to really know, because they're kind of hidden under labels. Schools report their disciplinary data to the Department of Public Instruction. They're in charge of reporting that. So they can kind of name an exclusion, an in-school suspension, when really it might be an alternative school placement. And so I think I will say, I might just go, I gotta chill out, because I'll go off into something else. But I will say that North Carolina, I think it's pretty good with collecting disciplinary data. I will say that. You can find a wealth of it on the Department of Public Instruction's website. But just to answer your question, that's mainly it. There are also disciplinary actions that are taken against students with disabilities. And maybe, Peggy, you want to jump in on that?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, there are lots of informal removals that happen short of out-of-school suspension that we see in the clinic. So, in-school suspension, which in theory is better because the student is in school, but what often happens is they're sent to a room, sometimes in the basement, usually not a qualified teacher running that program. No access to instruction, no access to work. You can, if you don't follow the rules, if you fall asleep, if you put your head on your desk, that's more days. You get an in-school suspension, so an incredibly punitive environment where we see the same disproportionate rates of ISS, in-school suspension, given to Black and brown students. And so that's one kind of like a hidden way that students are suspended. Also, just calling the parent to come pick up a student. We had a case recently where we were interviewing the parent, and we're talking about the disciplinary issue or the behavior challenges their child had because of their disability. And we were asking, like, oh, well, so how many times have they been since suspended? And they're like, oh, they haven't been suspended. We keep talking. They're like, well, they'll call us and they'll just say, like, they're having a hard day. Come pick them up. And we're like, well, how many times does this happen? And they're like, probably every other day. So and this is happening early in the morning. This child is missing most of their school day due to behavior challenges, and instead of addressing it through more services, more support, they're just sending them home. And so for students with disabilities, as Carlton alluded to, that's a huge violation of their federal rights, their federal protections for extra services as a student with disability to prevent that very thing of segregating and pushing out students with disabilities. So those are some things that we see that often happen underground and kind of without it necessarily going to the level of out-of-school suspension.
I'll just add one more intervention. They can have their kids arrested. And we are seeing in Wake County an influx of the crime of communicating threats of mass violence against an educational institution, which can be as simple as a kid posting something on social media, and they do, right? That's life these days, I'm going to shoot the place up. What we're seeing is even the way that these are handled, to me, is even more disturbing than the charge, although the charge is very disturbing. But they have law enforcement to investigate to see if it indeed is a credible threat. And law enforcement, I don't know what the data is, but in a lot of cases, will investigate and find out that indeed it is not a credible threat. It was a child that was jilted or whatever and was mad, and it's so easy just to get on your phone and do something like that without any really understanding of the consequences of those kinds of actions. That's a felony, folks. What's happening in Wake County is it used to be that when law enforcement would say this is not a credible threat, but the charge had been filed, the DA's office would send those cases to us. And we would work with the families, and we would work with the schools, and we would do what we do, which is we would bring people together and let them have conversations, and so that the kids could have a much better understanding about the consequences of what that threat meant. The school can have a voice in what the court system has mandated. And in most cases, schools are saying, we don't need court intervention. But there's a policy right now in our county that says you may not dismiss this case. And so these kids, even though it's been substantiated that it was not a credible threat, and this is law enforcement going to the house and doing a search, see if they find a weapon, see if they find anything that shows that this was a credible threat, and substantiating that it is not. And then us going through our process and doing a restorative process, which is to bring parties together to gain better understanding of what has happened, the harm done, and what can you do to address the harm. And even after that, the court is going forward with at least getting a plea to a misdemeanor or a good defense attorney taking it to trial. And I'm like, what in the hell are we doing? So I'm trying to find ways to fight that. I'm trying to find ways to work around that system. And I got into law school for the first 10 years of my career through the back door, and I like that approach. And so I'm doing all I can to keep using the back door and see what we can do to help these kids not get tangled up in this system. I do want to say, too, even though North Carolina did raise the juvenile age in 2019 from 15 to 17, it is still very easy when a kid is charged with a felony to be sent directly into the adult system.
We'll talk about all of those back doors in just a second, but you all kind of teed up my next question perfectly, which is kind of a two-parter. In these situations, what kind of rights do kids have, and do they know those rights or ever assert them?
Are you talking about the criminal side of things?
Yes, and when they're in the school system. before they've reached formal criminal procedures.
Well, I can, if somebody wants to talk about what their disciplinary rights are, and then I could talk about the rest.
As I was saying, this due process, and we're all familiar with that. With short-term suspensions, generally, students don't have due process rights. I mean, the court, Godspeed Lopez says they do. And what that means is you can voice your disfavor with your principal, and you get some notice. But with longer suspensions, like long-term suspensions, you get a full-on hearing in front of a school board, and you can petition the Superior Court to review the school board's decision. So long-term suspensions have a pretty significant, very significant due process rights, and this is why I would say that they're not long-term suspending kids anymore and place them into alternative school and calling it something else. In-school suspensions too, hardly any due process rights. Expulsions, full due process rights. I think that about covers it. But there are due process rights, or what we might call due process rights for children with disabilities who get disciplined at school.
And just to follow up, and the second part of that question of do they know those rights, I would say very rarely. The school district is not incentivized to do more than the basic kind of, you have a right to a hearing, like one line in a long letter about everything that's about to happen to your child. And even if they do take advantage of that appeal hearing, attorneys are expensive, and attorneys who do this work for free, like the Duke Children's Law Clinic, Legal Aid, are rare and have wait lists and have, limited capacity to take on all the cases. So even if a family does, understand their rights, the ability to get a lawyer, pay for a lawyer, and push back is very rare, unfortunately.
So, like what John's referring to is an investigation. So, I'm trying to figure out where to start. Thumbnail sketch is juvenile court is a separate court from adult criminal, as John was mentioning, by the jurisdiction of age. What rights you get in juvenile court stems from two main sources. One is the Constitution, and one is state law. In Ray Galt was a case that was decided in 1967, and through due process, big D, big P, through the 14th Amendment, you have protection against self-incrimination, you have a right to the notice of charges, you have right to an access to a lawyer, and you have a right to confront and cross-examine witnesses a lot like you do in adult criminal court. So the two pieces that are relevant here are protection against self-incrimination and the right to an attorney. So if school suspects something, I think schools are clever enough to have generally school administration ask the questions and law enforcement stand by, because that way it's not interrogation, right? Maybe, maybe not. Because what we also have is actually North Carolina is pretty strong in its state statutes at what it requires to be asking questions and what is admissible in court depending on who's there and who's not there and how old they are. You may or may also not be aware that just down the road there was a case where a kid had allegedly broken into some homes, and law enforcement didn't have any success in interviewing him at his house because his grandmother said no. So they went to school and interviewed him, talked to him, and basically he said, if I give the stuff back, will I still be in trouble? So he confessed. That case is better known as JDB versus North Carolina, because that case went through all three levels of the state court, and then it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. If y'all aren't familiar, the likelihood of getting into the U.S. Supreme Court case is the likelihood of winning 4 Super Bowls in a row. It just doesn't happen. But we were fortunate enough to get that case before U.S. Supreme Court. The basics are that when you're interviewing a kid, you have to consider their age as a factor as whether or not they're in custody. And so this is supposed to be happening, but again, sort of one of the end runs is having administration talk to the kid and not law enforcement. you have an absolute right to counsel in juvenile court in North Carolina. You don't have to determine indigency. So as soon as you're charged, you should be given a lawyer. Who that lawyer is and how we get there is a whole nother discussion for another day, but see me after church or class? What do I never thought I'd say see me after church. I'm Jewish, and it's more than a little strange. It's probably why I couldn't find the chapel either, because we got like one level. Anyway, moving on with that. So, but seriously, so when you get to court, you know, like John was saying, I mean, hopefully intrepid defenders, the first thing they should be looking at is the evidence against them. And the number one evidence against our clients is our clients. Because they're told any number of things. We're not going to suspend you. We'll let you go if you just tell us what's going on. It'll be easier for you. If you don't tell us, we'll call your parents. Right? All these things are being said to them so they can elicit a response, which may not even be truthful because they're scared or confused or don't understand what's happening. So once it gets to court, the first thing we tell them, and these communication of mass threat cases are abysmal, exactly as John described. And there's actually, I should know the name of the case, but I forgot. There was a case that happened out west where in a middle school, somebody had used a Sharpie in a bathroom stall and wrote bombs away and drew a little bomb. Folks, that case went all the way to our state Supreme Court before somebody said, that looks like bathroom humor. Why were you charged? I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars were put into a case where a kid was making a joke on a bathroom stall. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. Do things actually happen in school? Yes. Unfortunately, the beginning of the 2021-2022 school year, there were 2 shootings simultaneously in 2 different places. It's the first time that had ever happened. But the vast majority of the cases that come out of school are typical adolescent behavior, and what we've gotten good at is criminalizing that, unfortunately.
So let's piggyback off of that conversation. What are the collateral consequences of a juvenile conviction?
So tomorrow I'm presenting to the judges at UNC. If everybody wants to come to that, I'll be glad to. I'm serious. So I'm trying to do this quickly. So juvenile court is not as confidential as you think. And anybody can walk into court and observe it and then leave and talk about it, unless the judge tells you not to. The paperwork, the file, is really what's confidential. So anybody can find out about this. So that's thing number one. So don't think that it's just automatically sealed or there's some sort of process where nobody can find out about it, because that's not true. More and more places are asking about whether or not you have not been convicted, because convicted is a term of art. And usually when you see the word convicted as a lawyer, I'm like, you don't have to say nothing, because that says convicted. We are adjudicated in juvenile court. There's a whole different language, but it effectively means the same thing. But some places are asking about this. One example would be the military. All throughout the branches, they say, have you been in court? Have you been in trouble? Have you been in juvenile court? And even if you've been expunged, and your slate has been wiped clean, what do you answer to the military? Absolutely yes, I was in trouble. Why? Because then you could be charged with a federal crime for lying to the military. That's just one example. Another example, and specifically one that John pointed out about the felony. So communicating mass threats is a Class H felony. That's kind of low. It's a felony, but it's a low-level felony. How many of you knew that stealing a certain amount of pine straw in North Carolina is a felony? Raise your hand. Pine straw. Or violating some of the fishing laws in North Carolina. Right? These are felonies. Stealing a dog is a felony. Stealing a cat is not a felony. This is something else I do not understand. If I ever get elected, that's what I'm changing. The point is, there's a lot of felonies. If you're adjudicated of any felony either in middle school or in high school, you cannot play sports for the time you spend in that institution, period. There is no appeal, there's no consideration. I've had lawyers call me from County A saying, well, in County B, my client got charged with stealing a car, and he pled in County B, and now he's coming back to County A, and he was the football star for the high school program. I can't help you. And I won't go into how detrimental that is, not allowing youth to play sports. That is critical to some of their future. So those are just a few examples.
And how would you say a kid's involvement with the system at a young age affects the chances that they'll be involved with the system when they become an adult?
You don't have to believe me. Everybody needs to look up the North Carolina Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission juvenile recidivism reports. They just came out with their more recent one a few months ago. They've been doing this for now 15 years. Every report basically says the same thing, that the further you get into the system, the more likely you are is to reoffend both in juvenile court and adult criminal court. It's just that simple. And so if you have the ability, like restorative justice, to prevent the child from getting into the system in the first place, you are helping them. That sounds a little weird to some people because they're like, well, the juvenile justice system is supposed to be helpful, right? Well, it for some kids, maybe, but over a long span of time, it just statistically is not. But they have shown that when you provide early intervention, services they need in the home before they get into court, that's much more successful.
Can I add that that same thing is true for school suspension? And one of the things that is a reform that North Carolina has made is raising the age of juvenile court jurisdiction here. So now it's 8 for most offenses, or 10 for most offenses, 8 for some more serious offenses. So younger children can't be referred to court, but young children can still be suspended. And as my friend from Wilmington here knows, thousands of young children are suspended every year. We're talking preschool, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, tens of thousands. And that's something that, you know, is an area of hopeful reform, and some districts are working on it, but the same likelihood of getting into that cycle of the school to prison pipeline holds true for suspension at an early age.
So we talked about disparities in the suspension and school disciplinary process. Do you see the same disparities in terms of race, in terms of neurodivergency in the criminal system?
Yes. Yes, it's pronounced. And it gets, the level of disproportionality rises with how deep you go into the system. You're more likely to see higher numbers of kids who are detained, so you don't go to jail in juvenile court, but you go to a detention center like the Durham Youth Home here in Durham, and certainly once you're committed. It also impacts the front end of the system. There are less kids of color diverted than white kids. It's sort of like the reverse problem. But it's across the system. I don't know how much you want me to say about this. It's been studied by the federal government for over 40 years, and it's gotten worse over time.
Thank you. And then bringing it back to school, can someone give a landscape of what kind of law enforcement is involved in schools? So we've heard school resource officer. What's the difference between that and a regular police officer? What are we seeing in North Carolina? Like, what are the different, what's the landscape that we're looking at?
I can maybe start. And so in North Carolina, school resource officers are police officers, law enforcement officers who are stationed at a school for most of their time. That's kind of the term of art that we use. Districts usually have contracts with different law enforcement agencies to provide those school resource officers. And while there's been reforms recently to try to professionalize what a school resource officer is in terms of required training and kind of specialization of the role, that doesn't always hold true and has historically not been that they have to have any particular training. They don't even have to want to work with children. It can just be like, hey, we're going to assign you to this high school because you've been kind of messing up on the streets, and so we want to just give you this cush job over at the high school. And so that has been the case. And so we have seen more districts trying to professionalize, which people have different opinions on because it kind of institutionalizes the idea that we need police officers in school. But what I think, we don't have a good picture of where school resource officers are, what they're doing, what their impact is, because there's no requirement that they keep data. We mentioned the good discipline data we have in North Carolina around suspensions, expulsions. We don't have that same level of data around school-based arrests. We have a little bit of information from the Division of Juvenile Justice, just kind of how many of the juvenile arrests are school-based or juvenile refers are school-based, but we don't know what school resource officers are doing in our schools, and so we can't study where things might be working well. We can't study where things are really going off the rails. What we do know is, based on the little data we have, students of color, students with disabilities are being disproportionately referred to court for school offenses.
And I'll just jump in and say that one of the things that when we look at budgets and money, that is an area that is increasing in school system spending, is increasing the number of SROs that are in the buildings. At the same time, we are not increasing the number of counselors, the number of social workers, the number of psychologists, nurses, those other helping professionals that are so crucial in our schools that could be on the front side of this, preventing the need for the SROs in most cases. There is a place for SROs. I don't think they're completely something we could ever fully get rid of, but their role should be a final last resort, not the first line, which is what a lot of schools, it seems like, are, trying to use them as a replacement for a counselor when there's a fight or a kid who's disrespectful or, who needs food or a place to live that's manifesting as a behavior problem.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into how our North Carolina schools are funded in general. And I know our Reverend is a lot about this. So can you explain what the different types of schools are in North Carolina and how those are funded?
Yeah, so there's three main types of schools. I mentioned briefly public schools, traditional public schools being part of the districts. And those are funded primarily from state funding. About 65% in North Carolina, the funding comes from the state. We also have charter schools in North Carolina, which are funded with tax money, but they accept students based on lottery. They can set their own rules, and they have limited government oversight of how the money is spent. They can also kick out kids at any time for any reason. And so that's something that we see a lot in the data, is how many children enter charter schools but don't actually finish the whole year, especially if there are behavior problems or special needs, disabilities that they just don't serve. And then we have private schools, which are funded in theory by individuals, but the state has continued to expand our voucher or opportunity scholarship funding, and so a lot of schools are receiving some government funding to offset the cost of the private school. We have about 544 schools in the state that are private that receive public funding for about 2,600 or 26,000 children. 72% of those are religious, and 85% of the money that the government gives out to private schools goes to private Christian schools who can discriminate and often do discriminate. There's a really great recent study from Public Schools First NC that's on their website you can download that goes into the extreme discrimination that happens in a lot of these schools, especially the private Christian schools, based on beliefs or lifestyle or just not the right fit, quote unquote. So they're not required to serve every child. And the money follows the child. Like if they leave the public school and they go to a charter or a private school, the money follows the child, but it does not follow them back. So when a child leaves the private school because they get kicked out, or they leave the charter school and go back to the public school that has to serve them, the money does not go back. And so the school is then further unable to meet the needs of the children. I'll also say that when kids leave the public schools or the charter schools, they give up their IDEA rights, the Individuals with Disabilities Education rights, which is one of the things we've touched on. The federal government is, you're required by law for the federal government to provide services for kids with disabilities. but parents give that up and often don't realize it when they go to private schools. And I'll say the federal government has never fully funded the IDEA program. The state also doesn't fully fund it, and so we end up with an extremely underfunded disability services program, which directly impacts many, many of these children. The schools just don't have the resources that they need.
Once funding is earmarked for education in North Carolina, who decides where in the schools or on what we spend that funding? You kind of alluded to it about SROs.
Yeah, it's a complicated formula. The majority of the funding comes from the state, about 10% from the feds, and about 25% from local funding. And the budgets are set, the state budget is set by the legislature every 2 years. And that is pretty specific in where it has to go and how it gets calculated among per pupil spending. Then each individual district gets to set how they spend their funding, at least most counties that I'm aware of. Because school boards don't have taxing authority, the budgets are put together by the school system, the school board, and then presented to the county commissioners, and the county commissioners set the final budget amounts. And so it's a combination of all of those different parties involved. But there's a lot of statutes and a lot of requirements for how things get spent, like SROs, and I'm not super familiar with exactly how the formula works, but it is definitely there's big pots of money, but some of it comes down to individual schools and principals get to decide, but there's also a lot of oversight of who sets that.
I want to talk about the Leandro plan a bit. So
Yes.
a couple of you can explain what the Leandro plan is and where that case currently stands.
Yeah, so I don't know, I'll take this one. So the Leandro court case is a 30-year-old court case in North Carolina. It began in 1994 when 5 rural eastern North Carolina counties, Halifax, Vance, Hoke, Cumberland, and Robeson, sued the state of North Carolina, saying that the state was not providing the sound basic education that the Constitution of North Carolina requires. When our state, back in 1868, our state was re-entering the Union after the Civil War, we rewrote our Constitution, and it was a very progressive Reconstruction Constitution, and specifically some black clergy among a group pushed to be sure that the statute to require all children to receive a free education from the state was put into the Constitution. And so these counties said, you're not doing what's necessary. So that case has worked its way through the courts. It became a class action suit including the entire state, all 115 districts. And it has been to the Supreme Court now 3 times. It has won 3 times in the Supreme Court in North Carolina, which is as high as it can go. And we've received word recently that the current Supreme Court is going to rehear the case that was most recently decided in November of last year. So it's been just a year that we've had the court ruling that said they must fund years 3 and 4 of the plan. And the legislature says, no, we refuse to pay the money that's necessary. And so the plan, the Leandro plan itself, was the 8-year plan that was put together to get us into compliance with our Constitution. This is to get us out of the basement and into the main floor of the school. This is not getting us to world class. It's not aspirational. It is bare minimum. And we are being underfunded over $3 billion annually. Durham County is owed 32% more, which is about $70 million a year more from the state than what they're currently receiving. So a lot of these things that we're talking about could be very easily addressed. It's a solvable problem. This is a situation where North Carolina has the funding. We just don't have the political will to actually invest in our children. in preparing for tonight, I looked up some of the information about how much we spend on inmates per day versus our school funding. Someone had asked me the other day, so I looked it up. We spend about $131 a day per inmate. We have 29,000 inmates. This is the adult system. That's over $1.4 billion a year that we spend on prison, or about $47,000, almost $48,000 a year per inmate. We currently are spending about $8,600 per child to educate them. So the disparity, which you can't necessarily, it's not comparing apples to apples, I realize, but, and I also realize the court system and the prison system is underfunded and understaffed as well. But it's amazing to me how we're willing to pay for one thing but not to invest in our children, where we could actually make a dramatic difference. And one of the things I've wondered, and you all might know this, how much has our police funding increased since 1994? How much has our court funding increased? How much has our other funding increased when our education funding has just been proportionally so decreasing? They say they spend more every year on education, but proportionally we continue to lose ground.
I don't know the answer. Like, I know that there's increasing number of SROs, so I would imagine that in that bucket, funds have increased. And I guess the other point I'd make is usually with any funding increase for schools, there comes this like call for accountability. It's like, we'll give you more money, but you got to show us good test scores, or you got to prove yourself, and it falls on teachers and principals often. Yet we've given money, millions of dollars here in Durham each year to make sure SROs are in our schools without any call for accountability. So increases in funding are coming without the same standards that traditionally are applied to educators and schools.
Yeah. And that funding is also, the accountability pushes are put towards traditional public schools and are not held to, the charters and privates are not held to the same standards, even though they're being given tax money as well. And that's something that many of us are very frustrated about, that the lack of accountability.
How do you all think that some of this funding, even the bare minimum funding, could help alleviate some of the problems we've discussed in the disciplinary system and the eventual criminal legal involvement?
My biggest two things, I think. One, IDEA funding could be increased dramatically and meet the needs for it, not just the 12% that we say we're going to cover of disability students. Why an arbitrary number? But the biggest thing, I think, is the adults in the building, having the necessary required ratio or the recommended ratios for nurses, counselors, psychologists, and social workers. I mean, I think that preventative support would eliminate a lot of that work off of our teachers, which is a big piece of what they do, is dealing with the social work and the counseling issues and so on. It would help get more children identified with disabilities and getting them treatment. And it would help just provide that extra resource when a teacher does need a break, to have an adult to be able to work one-on-one with a child in the room or in the building without having to resort to suspending them or punishing them. We are 4 times the recommended ratio right now of psychologists in North Carolina to students. It should be 1 to 500, and ours is almost 1 to 2,000. For social workers, it's the same. It's 4 times the number recommended is what we're doing. So, we're not even close. We just don't have enough adults.
And the adults we have are not being paid well or treated as professionals often. I'm biased, I'm married to a public school educator, but I do think that he sees daily people just leaving the profession because it's not sustainable, and we don't treat it with the respect that it deserves.
And we don't pay for the training and the support, professional development either that they need to be able to be the best that they can be. Our teachers are working so incredibly hard. But they're being asked to do a Herculean task with no support, and it's just, it shows. But that's also part of the plan. They're trying to privatize our schools. The large push across the nation is to defund our schools. And the way that they do that is by saying they're failing. And they're not failing, they're just underfunded. But that drives their narrative.
Thank you so much for kind of providing this history of and the current status of this reality that is affecting kids in the public system. But I would want to talk a little bit about what we can do moving forward. I know we've touched a little bit on more funding, getting rid of or trying to increase less SRO participation and more preventative measures. But what can we do generally to combat this trend that we're seeing in public schools?
Or just to follow up on that quickly, I think also like what can we do specifically in terms like me and Taylor and everyone here?
Vote is the number one. We need to change the legislature and to put people in office who care about our kids.
I would just say, I'm not interested, well, I am interested in using less police officers in our schools, but I'm not interested in creating a policy that takes SROs out of schools right now. I would love to get there. Let's leave that alone, because if we don't have to pick a fight, let's don't pick a fight. But let's do increase funding that does the things that she was just talking about, which puts more counselors and psychologists and social workers in the schools. But let's also work with our great community resources. And I'll just tell you, one reason that schools in Wake County love us is because we have proven to them that when we walk in the door, they don't have to deal with nearly as many disciplinary problems as they're used to dealing with. We walk in the door and they go, oh my God, so good to see you. Who do you need to see? And we tell them, and they get the kids, and we do our thing. And principals will tell us, I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it, because those kids are not on my radar screen anymore. And so it's not just solving the problem for today, it's solving the problem for good. And we kept data for a lot of years when we were under grant funding, that sort of thing, that proves that that is the case. I want to address teachers too. Teachers get a bad rap. Walk in a school and watch what they are dealing with and watch what they are doing. They are there because they are committed to it. They are there because this is a call for them, and they are being crushed. And so restorative practices are good for our adults in the building too. We had a school a couple of weeks ago that had lost a principal who died at her desk, a teacher who suddenly died, and a student that suddenly died. And they asked if we could go in and do circles. The school system said, no, we have a crisis intervention team to handle that. And they don't go in and provide services. They go in and tell people what they need to do to make themselves feel better. And the principal specifically said, don't send your crisis team. They have come every time we've had a crisis. When my staff sees them walk in the door, they are traumatized just by seeing them walk in the door. We want a circle, because we had done circles over and over and over, and they knew how beneficial it was. I just suggested, let's do 3 pilot schools in Wake County. Let's do an elementary school, let's do a middle school, let's do a high school, where we've got previous data. Let's put more counselors and more programming in the school. Let's evaluate it for 3 years, and then let's do a comparison. No, that can't happen. I don't understand why that can't happen. I'm not saying get rid of your SRO. I'm saying increase these services that provide social and emotional care for your students and for your teachers. It doesn't seem like a hard decision to me. And we do it for free, for crying out loud. For free.
Lawyers aren't free, generally. I do want to get rid of law enforcement in schools. We're not going to. We had a golden opportunity just 2 years ago. Anybody remember the pandemic? Right. So there was a slight uptick in crime by youth during the pandemic. But, you know, if you put law enforcement in schools, they're going to charge kids for a number of reasons. One, they're not being trained like Peggy alluded to. But there's a bigger reason too that I don't know that we've touched on, but I think in some of these other discussions, SROs are not treated the same as law enforcement within their own communities. I don't know if you know this, but they're seen as less than a beat officer or a sheriff or whatever. I don't know how to fix that, but it would be better if they could be supported within their own law enforcement communities and given the training, but also sort of, you know, some form of esteem that they don't have. Because the first SROs were folks who just could not make it, and we put them over here. I don't think that's the case anymore. You know, but as John says, they're not going anywhere. And so I think the thing to do is to kind of work towards what can we do where we don't need them anymore. The other thing I'll say is two other things. One is data is tricky and sometimes help and sometimes doesn't. Can anybody name a report anywhere that says having law enforcement in schools either makes schools safer or makes kids feel safer? Anybody? Because there isn't one. All this discussion about funding, people do it because they feel like it's the right thing to do. It doesn't matter what you put in front of them, and that's discouraging because we should be making decisions based on information and not based on how school was in the 1970s when Eric went to school. That's not how we should be making decisions. The last thing is we should reconsider why we have a juvenile justice system in the first place and just relook at it. Historically, juvenile justice was meant to help integrate white immigrants from other countries into society. It was not meant to interact with all persons in our society. So it was created on the basis of excluding people. And we've never readdressed that in 100 years. We need to seriously consider readdressing why we have a system. Why don't we have more restorative justice? Look at so many other countries. You know, some kids don't get charged until they're 15 or 16 in some countries. And even when they do, they're not being locked away. What is it that we figured out that they haven't? Nothing. That's what we figured out. So I know that's a bigger ask, but I'm looking over here and you asked me what you all can do. Those are some ideas.
Thank you.
Say something real quick. Because this is something I'm thinking about all the time, and I don't have an answer for you. I'm pissed off just about every day because I see a kid, a middle schooler, bring a Nerf gun, and they put him out of school for the rest of the year because he's in possession of a weapon. Or I see a kid get put in handcuffs for 20 minutes because she knocked over a trash can, and the officer says, "You're my prisoner. You destroy public property." Or I see a 12-year-old girl who's in the AIG program and the AVID program who gets put into an alternative school for the rest of the school year because she was in the presence of one of her friends who makes the school a threat. Every day it's more absurd. And I'm just like, well, what can you do about that? The teachers are under pressure and the principals are under pressure, but what's leading us to think that taking a kid out of the school is the way you fix the problem? How do you fix a problem by taking education away? It's so backwards. It's so backwards. How do you teach that to an educator? I have no idea, because it's like a value system. You've got to say, I want the kid in school. That's your primary thing. How do you get someone to think that way? Like, this is a last resort, the absolutely last resort. I'm going to take an education away from you. There's a Supreme Court case here in the state that says a child can forfeit his right to an education. How? A child can't enter a contract, but I can forfeit my education? How? That's a Supreme Court justice. It's mind-boggling. So I just want to jump in and just say, like, I don't know the answer to that question. Other than us getting really mad and the public just saying we're not going to take it, and like parents saying we're not, but then what do you do? Take my kid out of school? And that's kind of what some legislature, I'm not supposed to speak out against the legislature. You get funded by Congress, so we're not supposed. But well, that's what they want. I just don't know. You know, other than, this has got to happen more. We've got to do something. But Roy Cooper's got on the website, somewhere on some website, sorry. But he's claimed we're in a state of emergency. Our education system's in a state of emergency. That is a fact. I don't think that's an opinion. If that's the case, well, what are we doing? If we're in a state of emergency, we got to do something. So I was just sitting here, and it's something, and I wanted to jump in because I'm asking myself that all the time, and I don't have an answer. Other than like talking more about this. Peter's in the building. He's going to the school board meetings like every time they have one. And he's bringing people with him, and he's leaning on them, and he's educating them, trying to educate them. I don't know if you can if you're not listening. But he's in there putting the work in. And so it's just, all you can do is the organization is called Loving Our Children. We got to do that. How do you make someone? You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know.
Thank you. Right now, we're going to switch to Shannon and Angela, and then we'll open it up for a few questions if we have time at the end. So Shannon, you want to raise your hand? She's raising a 15-year-old boy with a history of significant trauma that affects his behavior. He's a child in the Durham Public Schools, and like I said, he's only 15, and he has been suspended at least 8 times. Though Shannon notes she has lost track. And for confidentiality purposes, we're going to call this child Drew. Shannon, can you share with us what it's been like being a guardian navigating the disciplinary system? Oh, sorry.
Okay, so I think it'll be hard for me to keep up using the word Drew, so I'm just going to trust you're keeping this confidential, and I appreciate you all being here. It's a gift to just listen to stories and want to help make such important change. So my oldest one